All right. So welcome everybody. Assalamu alaikum. Good morning, good evening, depending on where you are. My name is Ermin Sinanovic. I am Executive Director of the Center for Islam in the Contemporary World at Shenandoah University in Virginia. And this is our second book talk in our book talk series. And today we are very honored to have with us Dr. Zahra Ayubi from Dartmouth College. Welcome, Zahra.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So the book that we are discussing is her latest book. It's called Gendered Morality. It was published by Columbia University Press last year. The subtitle of the book is Classical Islamic Ethics of the Self, Family, and the Society. The book had been so far warmly received in academic circles and had initiated quite a bit of discussion, a good one. And we are here with the author of the book to give us a little bit more of insight on the book. And the idea of these talks is not to present the whole book, because that would be impossible in 45 minutes conversational style together with Q&A. It is more to get the basic idea of what the book is about, some of the main insights of the book, and hopefully the people who are listening to this conversation will leave with a good understanding directly from the author, but more importantly, hopefully with a desire to actually go out and buy and read the book, because I want people to read books, right? So Dr. Ayubi, I will start with this question. First question, what motivated you to write the book, and how does it relate to your broader academic interests? And as a sort of corollary of that question is, if you could give us like a basic overview of what the book's argument is all about and what the whole book project is about.
Yeah. Well, thank you for having me. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. What motivated me to write the book was actually that often a lot of people when they take a gender biased position or some sort of hostile practice towards women or others, they often don't do it by referring to verses of the Quran or Hadith or fiqh, for example, but they may post hoc find justifications in those sources to do so. And a lot of times for people that tends to mean, oh, there's a disconnect between Islam and culture, and that culture causes people to do things, and Islam is pure and untouched. And that might be true in certain cases, but what I find lacking in that explanation often is that Islam is known to human beings through the medium of their culture. And so for me, the disconnect between hostile practices towards women or gender biased positions in thought and practice and theory is and the disconnect between that and what people are reading in their religious tradition is sort of this, is filled by this, what I consider to be sort of a deeply philosophical perspective of patriarchy, and a deeply rooted philosophical position of bias against women in particular, but other people as well, non-elite people as well, and that sort of is the approach, or like a generalistic kind of approach to life, but also to religious discourses, which sort of motivates people to have this and to have these positions. And so I feel like I really needed to study Islamic philosophy in that regard and ask sort of larger questions about our gendered ethics, really, and in general, and in the Islamic tradition in particular.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Now, you base your study on a close reading of 3 philosophical works that are within the akhlaq or ethics tradition within Islamic tradition. So can you tell us what these 3 works are, and why did you choose these 3 particular works, and why are they important to be studied within this context?
Yeah, the book generally, for the most part, relies on research on 3 sources. Ghazali's Kimya Saadat, Nasruddin Tusi's Akhlaq al-Nasiri, and Jalaluddin Davani's Akhlaq al-Jalali, or Jalalian Ethics. And these are respectively from the 12th, 13th, and 15th centuries. And they're all written in Persian. And why I chose these in particular is that they are right in front of us. So these are texts, particularly Ghazali's work and Tusi's work, and Davani is less known per se, but still is a major figure within the intellectual tradition, at least. And so, but the other two are certainly figures that many lay people will recognize, especially Ghazali, and because they are so prominent within Muslim imagination as well as the intellectual tradition, I felt like these are the texts that I want to study, because we take for granted what's in them. We take for granted that they are the moral record of Islam, and that they have hierarchical biases in them is sort of also taken for granted. And so for me, it was really important to look at texts that have a really, really rich reception history that lots of people have read. They're because they were in Persian from the time period, they were read from, the far reaches of the Ottoman Empire all the way through the Mughal Empire, just sort of over the course of centuries, and are still widely read today and widely esteemed today. So so for that reason, I think it was just really important for me to do this type of engagement, feminist critique engagement with these texts.
Right, thank you. Now, all three works are originally written in Persian language. Was that a conscious choice? Were you trying to maybe get away from this Arabocentric notion of Islam and look at other areas? One of the themes, for instance, that we have at our center is a theme called Islam on the Edges, where we look at the edges of Islam, geographical, but also theological, and in other ways to highlight and manifest the global nature of Islamic civilization, Islamic tradition, not just focusing narrowly on usually what is understood as Middle East and North Africa, which is dominated by Arabic, which is obviously hugely important. And it is most important language in Islamic tradition, but it doesn't mean that there are no other languages in which major contributions have been made. So was that a conscious choice for you, and why did you make it?
Yeah, definitely was a conscious choice. So it also had to do with my training. So coming from UNC Chapel Hill, where I did this doctoral work originally, upon which this book is based on, I came from a scholarly training that emphasized the periphery as a center, or the anti-canon in a way, right? So these scholars that I am studying, so this Ghazali, Tusi, and Davani in this book, they also wrote in Arabic, right? So when they did, suddenly they become central, and when they don't, they are peripheral, right? The Persian language was, in fact, for a long time one of the major Islamic languages, certainly within the courtly tradition of multiple different courts across Islamdom, and also was sort of rivaled Arabic in terms of the richness of content, right? And the text that I read in particular, Ghazali even says at the introduction of this Kimya Saadat that he's writing in Persian because lots more people will read it. So for him, it's not so much that it was on the edge, was more actually that it was more central for him, which I kind of I really appreciated, and I think that it's a lot more. It's not still not less technical as far as discussion about philosophy. None of the texts are less technical in terms of their philosophical discussions about the nafs or whatever. And but still, I feel like Persian the Persian text, the fact that they were in Persian was really important for me, to highlight that this that precisely what we may think of as peripheral to Islam was actually rather central.
Yeah, thank you. I remember, obviously, I grew up in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and in Bosnia, in sort of traditional Islamic period, people would say that scholars used to master 4 languages. One is Bosnian, because obviously that is the language of the place, Arabic for religious scholarship, Ottoman Turkish for administration, and Persian for poetry.
Mhm.
So it was a multilingual civilization and contribution, but obviously Persian is used not only in poetry, but also philosophical and ethical works, many of which had been written in that particular language. Okay, I want to turn to the contents of the book. So in your book, you used 3 analytical concepts: femininity, masculinity, and homosexuality.
Mhm.
Femininity, masculinity, and homosexuality. Can you briefly explain each of them and why they form your analytical framework, and how do they help us in understanding what you are actually trying to do in this work?
So femininity and masculinity, I employed particularly because so much of the ethical precepts that I found in these texts come down to gender roles. So it's not so much necessarily about how to be a man or a woman per se, specifically, because they're not necessarily talking about that, but they are. But they are talking about gender roles within that. So even if Ghazali, Tusi, and Davani didn't understand gender as we do, certainly they did understand gender roles in distinct sort of ways. And homosociality, though, was a bit more, takes a bit more explaining, because uh, because initially when I read the texts, I didn't necessarily think I'm going to employ a framework of homosociality to understand these texts, right? It wasn't that I had read some theory and then I was trying to impose it upon these texts. It actually came from my reading of the texts themselves. So I read them and I thought so much of the ethics within these texts have to do with men's relationships to each other, have to do with friendship and how to be an ethical man, and how to and in relation to other men, and how to be a teacher, how to be a student, how to be a husband, how to how to be a husband, but in the context of a family that is led by other men. So how to deal with how to framed as how to deal with a wife's family as well, father and brothers and so on. How to be a good subject of the court, how to be a good subject of a king, um,
Mhm.
and how to be in charge of people, underlings, right, employees or servants and things like that. So much of the imagination of these of the thinkers were focused on the akhlaq of the ethics of how to be a man with other men. And
Mhm.
so for me, I really needed to have language and frameworks that described this the male male relationships, and the multiplicity of them, right? It wasn't singular. It was, different modes of being a man. So it's not just masculinity in relation to women, but also masculinity in relation to other men, and how other men actually um, sometimes competed, or sometimes emasculated one another based on their actions towards each other, or how they bolstered one another, or supported each other. So to me, to analyze the male relationships with nuance required a framework of homosociality. And ultimately, I found that so much of the patriarchy that was the patriarchal cosmology was in fact created not through just a subordination of women, but also the kinds of relationships that are hierarchical among men.
All right. So to what extent do you think that kind of hierarchical relationship is also related to the way that the societies are culturally ordered and the way in which both men and women were traditionally socialized in Muslim societies, where they often would most of the time socialize only with their own gender.
Mhm.
And for instance, for the men, the only females that they would be in touch with would be the close members of their family.
Mhm.
Um, and so to what extent do you think that had influenced this kind of hierarchical ordering, and maybe even influenced the way how philosophically they understood Islamic sources?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question because it also um, prompts us to bring in social history into this conversation too, right? I mean, it's not just the world of akhlaq in the texts of akhlaq, but also people's real life akhlaq that developed as a result of real life relationships. And what I found the text to be, I mean, what I found in the text is that there's very interesting relationship if you with social history, if you look at it that way, because on the one hand we can say that yes, there were definitely women all over the place. It wasn't like pure gender segregation in the way that the ulama would want gender segregation, right? I mean, women were part of court, and that's why people like Ghazali are upset that women are at court, right? Or women are part of the public sphere as well, and that's why there are texts that sort of talk about how women shouldn't be because they're interfering in what they viewed to be the man's world. And so women were part of um, a society that was not as gender segregated as the elite tradition would have us believe. But nonetheless, this idea that segregation was in fact some sort of ideal, was idealized, is present in the akhlaq, and in ways that show a reassertion of this desire to keep gender spheres separate. But nonetheless, I mean, that also sort of encouraged me to, when I read these attitudes, I also, it encouraged me to sort of think about, as I said, the relationships between men, because that also is what creates patriarchy, right? So homosociality end up being the sort of the building blocks of patriarchal society at large. um yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks. No, that's great. So let's turn now to philosophy as presented in these three works. How do these three works create hierarchical cosmologies that you talk about in the book? And what do you mean by these hierarchical cosmologies?
So they do it through metaphysics and virtue ethics, right? So in the metaphysics, it's interesting because at the same time, even as things are hierarchical, right? The the ethicists will say things like, all matter is created equal, and all substance is created equal, and and so for them, each molecule or each atom is equal to any other molecule or atom, right? And regardless of where it is or what its destination or destiny is, right, in a way. And that's, sort of speaking to the creator's manifestation within matter, right? Or the creator's ability to create, and that ability is the same in no matter if it's a woman or a man, it's a blade of grass, it's a cow, whatever. And so so that equality is very, very quickly overshadowed by what I argue is the sort of belief that all things are not exactly created equal in the ethicist minds. So it's sort of like Animal Farm, right? Where it's all animals all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. In the sense that they very quickly move to hierarchical language and say things like, oh, well, the female of the species is inferior to the male of a species, or we'll say things like, the animals that have, cognitive and thinking functions that show adaptability are higher than those that don't show adaptability or whatever, right? And they sort of rank humanity on rungs of rationality, and rungs of rationality. Okay, that might be a justified way of organizing or ordering society in hierarchy, or the cosmos or the world in that in a hierarchy. But then who decides who is more rational than someone? And oftentimes it's women who are thought of as being irrational. It's thought of as people who are less elite because of class, because of being in those times enslaved status, and even now as being less rational, and therefore that's why they are born in what they are born in, or that's why they cannot ever change what they are, because they have this diminished rational capacity. And it's sort of a cyclical thing, because you are in the condition that you are in because you are less rational, but you are less rational to begin with. That's why you're born into the condition that you are in, or you continue to be in that condition. And so that sort of that circular reasoning is very much present and creates the metaphysical aspect of the hierarchy. Then there's the virtue ethics, which is not necessarily so much about the universe and the cosmos, but or matter, but more so about human beings' interactions with one another, and that is incredibly hierarchical and requires the elite Muslim male who would be the audience of these texts, to in many ways instrumentalize those around him for his own refinement, his own purposes. And so that's the primary mechanism through which the hierarchical cosmology moves from metaphysics to then virtue ethics and how people are supposed to behave.
Right. Thank you. So talking about virtue ethics, one of the areas that all of these three works talk about quite a bit, and that you give quite a bit of attention in your book, is obviously ethics, the ethics of marriage. Mm-hmm. So can you tell us a little bit about how these three authors conceptualize the ethics of marriage? And then as an extension of that, in your opinion, how are they similar or different to the fiqhi jurisprudential understandings of marriage? Because you have someone like Al-Ghazali, who is well known as a juristic scholar. He's done some major books in usul al-fiqh, in foundations of and principles of Islamic jurisprudence. But he's also an ethicist. And to what extent does his fiqhi understanding translate to ethics, and to what extent does it not, and why?
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, thanks for asking this question. I love to point out that so many of the ethicists, including the three that I worked on, but also so many others, were also other things. They were also jurists. They were also mystics. Sufis, many of them. They were also, surgeons in the case of Tusi, and astrologers, and all of these other things, and mathematicians, and so some of them played many different roles and wrote in multiple genres, and the genres don't necessarily contradict one another, but when writing in a particular genre, they were still aware of other discourses, obviously, but when writing in akhlaq, each of these three that I've worked on, but also other ethicists, very much focus on the epistemologies of their genre that they're writing in at the moment. And so for them, the justifications, the discussions, the types of questions, which is really where it's the most interesting for me, the types of questions that they're asking and answering are indeed very different and dictated by the genres in which they're writing. And so so the fiqh discussion of marriage tends to be focused on the legalities of contracting and dissolving marriage. So it's very much about, who can marry whom, when can they marry, how, under what conditions can they marry, and what constitutes valid marriage, so on and so forth. Or what, how does one go about obtaining divorce? What are the different things? If it's a man, what are the rules? If it's a woman, what are the rules? If there is a qadi around, what are the rules? And so on and so forth. And those discussions tell us a lot about the status of men and women, the unequal status of men and women within the legal tradition, within the law, right? But the akhlaq genre is not focused on those legalities, and rather it's oriented towards how men and women are human beings towards one another, right? And what kind of human beings they are in the tradition. And so it considers their nafses, right? Their metaphysical souls. And within marriage, the nafs becomes important, not just of the person who the audience is, which is the husband, but also the nafs of the wife is important too, in the sense that Ghazali will say things like, your wife has a nafs too, so you have to be cognizant of that when you treat her. But that doesn't necessarily mean that he goes into the direction of, that means she's your equal. He goes in the other opposite direction, which is frustrating, right? As he says, well, because she has a nafs, you have to be considerate of that when you're asking her to do X, Y, and Z for you, right? And in his world, the wife's purpose is to give you the benefits, so that is to give a male Muslim the benefits, so that the male Muslim would then, the elite male Muslim, I should say, would then be able to practice the path of refinement. And so she takes care of the cooking and the washing and the cleaning and the children and the and so on and so forth, or organizes that, if not doing it herself. And so it's really, so the akhlaq vision of marriage is very much about what one does in marriage, and how one is supposed to treat one's wife and family in marriage, and less so about legalities. Yeah. I mean, there's so much more to say about that, but
of course.
yeah.
And we hope that our audience are going to read the book for the rich discussions that you're bringing. But I had a follow-up question to that. So obviously, I think all of these authors write from a male perspective. And they do talk about, the rights and duties and the righteous, virtuous conduct by both husband and wife. Do they ever consider things from a female perspective at all, or do they take female point of view into account, or is it completely absent from this work?
I mean, unfortunately, it is completely absent. So they're assuming that the readers are other elite Muslims like themselves, right? I mean, they were elite Muslim men, and they're assuming that their students are their readers, their students in the madrasas, and their ulama in training. But I mean, as I said at the outset, I mean, they also thought that these texts would be, because especially they were in Persian, they thought that it would be available to a wider audience. And that wider audience for them consisted of other elite Muslim men in other professions, not necessarily people who were training to become part of the ulama. And so, but other professions, meaning, there were all sorts of other things. I mean, there were scribes, and there were, court clerks, or other things that were also elite in many ways, elite professions. And so the women's perspectives are not part of their vocabulary in any way. I mean, the only moments at which they may potentially reflect are the line that I already mentioned, right? About, oh well, women have nafses too, so therefore, and that's really the closest that we see in the texts of them sort of acknowledging that women are in fact, thinking, living, breathing, and would have a stake in ethics. And there are passages about how to raise a daughter, which are really focused on the duties of a father to, in a way, square away his daughter. So it's really about all the blessings that a daughter will bring to her father by through her raising her in a righteous way and then marrying her off. And so so much of that is about the father again, and not so much about the educational training or the akhlaq or anything for that matter of the daughter, which in contrast to that, they do go into a lot of detail about how to raise a son, with and the son is being raised in these texts in a very similar fashion to the mirrors the akhlaq training that's written into the text for the father. So so in that contrast, you can sort of see that the texts are not necessarily accounting for women much. Yeah.
I see. All right. Thank you. I'd just like also to remind our online audience that we have live chat option on YouTube. So if you have any questions or comments, please submit them. If you don't want to identify yourself, that is understandable. But if you would identify a country that you're from, that would be, I think, nice to know and useful. I'm assuming that we are being listened to and watched on different continents, and it would be nice to know what country the audience from and where they're submitting questions from. So another question that I had as a follow-up to this conversation is, so how do these three works transpose their ideas to wider social contexts? So they have philosophical understandings, philosophical discussions. They talk about virtuous conduct. They talk about marriage. They talk about different, obviously, areas of life.
Mm-hmm.
How do these philosophical considerations affect or impact wider social context and relations beyond marriage, beyond domesticity, beyond domestic life?
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so I talk a lot about this in chapter 4 for the people who are really paying attention to my text. But basically, what they do is they move from the self to the domestic to then the social and the societal, right? And that's built in. That larger, that micro to the macro is sort of and is built into as a built-in feature of the text, and the texts themselves progress in this way. And so I also chose to progress in that way in the book. When they do get to the broader social, so much of the akhlaq is then moves towards the homosocial that I was talking about earlier, the relationships between men, because they idealistically the ethicists are thinking that the social is a homosocial male world, and so they talk about friendships and enemies and how to deal with adversaries and politics and And so there is an element of first your inner circle of friends, and then your outer circle of people who you know, but you're not really friendly with, and they give advice as to how to deal with them. And then they talk about a man's responsibility to the ruler, the local ruler, or I guess sultan, depending on who the audience is. And so, in many ways, what the texts talk about and how they really take this telescopic view is, and they say it themselves. They say, a person, a man has achieved his goal when he becomes an alam saghir in himself, right? So a microcosm of the cosmos of the universe in himself. And so that akhlaq of the self then gets exported in a way to how one is supposed to comport with family, and how one then is supposed to comport with all of society, and indeed the world and the cosmos, right? And that natural ordering of the universe, of how the creator has put things where they belong and in equal measure and weight, and that's referring to Quranic ideas, right, about the universe, then in fact is something that, if a person is perfectly ethical, then the things that the weights of the world, so the people of the world would then be ordered, or society would then be ordered in a similar sort of fashion, and would be a result of each individual, or that individual practicing his akhlaq in a certain way. And so that's really not just the way that the ethicists export akhlaq to the society, but also export ideas of patriarchy to all of the society, that the patriarchy is the major ordering principle of not just the family, but also society, and indeed the universe.
Okay, thank you. Well, we have first few comments online. We have somebody watching from South Africa, Anissa. And we have somebody from Singapore as well. So we're being watched on the edges, as you can see. And welcome to everybody once again. So the question from Singapore is, I'm curious to know if you would identify yourself as an Islamic feminist or a Muslim feminist, or do you find such labels unnecessary? So that's the first question. As a follow-up, the same person is asking, do you think the work you do fits with the notion of liberation theology? So are you a Muslim feminist, and is this liberation theology?
These are really big questions. Thank you for asking them, and thank you for watching. First, do I consider this to be works of feminist theology? Do I consider myself a feminist, a Muslim feminist? I mean, I am Muslim, and I am also very feminist. So I guess I am a Muslim feminist. People are really uncomfortable with the label feminist because of the colonial baggage and the paternalistic forms of feminism that white feminism has taken over the course of the last couple of centuries, and so people don't like the term. But if we boil the term feminist down to the idea of somebody who believes that women are human beings, and somebody who believes that in gender equality, then feminist is a perfectly fine label, I guess, to adopt. But it really depends, I guess, on how one defines it, particularly because of this really problematic colonial discourse, right? And which is still very prevalent today within paternalistic white feminism. So I would say I'm both of those things, Muslim and feminist, or Muslim feminist. And as far as the work being how I would characterize the work, so what I want to do in with this text with this book is to really pull on. Is to really sort of push our direction of scholarship within those of us who study gender in Islam, as well as Islamic ethics in general, nothing having to do with gender per se, to push us to think philosophically when it comes to questions about gender in Islam. And what I mean by thinking philosophically is to really sort of ground ourselves in the questions of how we as a society think of ourselves, think of the human condition, and think of humanity in gendered terms, and what asking that question actually does for individuals who have a multitude of experiences that don't necessarily fit into the elite Muslim male model or elite model in general. And this is a question that, how we're supposed to live. Philosophers ask this all the time. How are we as human beings supposed to live, and what what is the purpose of the good life, especially if not everyone has access to the good life, right? And that's really the philosophical basis for what I'm trying to do in this book, and hopefully starting the conversation about taking a philosophical turn within gender and Islam. Do I think it has theological implications? It does, in the sense that people will think about the nature of the creator, nature of God, in thinking about, well, how, if one considers these ethicists or prior or other Muslim thinkers as being people who reflected on creation, on God's creation of the universe as being from a male perspective, right? That somehow the universe is supposed to reflect patriarchal order, and specifically is ordered by men in hierarchical, patriarchal ways. Then asking the question from feminist perspectives would definitely posit theological implications as to what the purpose of the world is. But I think that these are interesting questions for no matter whom we're talking about, right? So people don't necessarily have to be Muslim in order to think through the question of access to the good life, and access to what moral conduct and behavior looks like.
All right, thank you. We have a few more comments and one more question. There is somebody watching from South Africa who says that he's half Danish and half Iraqi, on the edge of the edges. We have somebody watching from Indonesia as well, so it's truly global. And obviously from the US. We have a question from Germana, who is a friend. Salam, Germana. She's watching from Poland, and she has a question. She's asking, can you elaborate more on the concept of patriarchy that you use? So what is the concept of patriarchy you're using? How do you define it, and which particular concept of it you employ?
Yeah. So the patriarchy that I'm talking about in the Akhlaq texts are really basically the idea that the paternalistic idea, right, of that men, elite men in particular, they know better, right, because of their position in society, and their by virtue of their birth as being male, and by virtue of their birth as being male, it ultimately shows, to the ethicists, means that they have automatically occupy higher states of being, and higher forms of rationality compared to others. And that becomes the root of this idea that because they happen to have, in a way, better nafses and better ability to train their nafses and better rationality, that they know better for others. And this leads to the idea that they should be the adjudicators of God's will upon earth, right? So we didn't talk about the term khalifa or khilafa a lot in our discussion, but that is a prominent term that comes up in the akhlaq texts, because they, in addition to becoming a microcosm of the universe, the goal of akhlaq is to create mini little khalifas. Everybody's a khalifa of the universe, and that is, yes, that's a Quranic concept, right? That a lot of
Can you explain what it means for those who do not necessarily understand Arabic?
yeah. So it is a Quranic concept that refers to human beings' responsibility of stewardship and vicegerency, like is a term that I use in the book, stewardship of the earth, right? And so that the Quranic ideal that scholars like Amna Wadud have talked about the khilafa as being sort of a Quranic imperative upon every single person, and that's sort of a potentially equalizing kind of factor. But for the akhlaq texts and the ethicists, only they thought of khilafa in a very sort of male concept, of that, and historically we know that khalifa is a term that has described male Muslim rulers, and they self adopt that term as well, and so it's something that that also indicates the type of patriarchy that the ethicists are actually promoting, right? Is the idea that men are khalifas of this earth in a way that it's not that they're necessarily protecting and maintaining, which is a term that a lot of people like to put when they describe khalifa, but it's more like they are ordering based on their own rationality and their own ability to be the most rational and the most refined. And truth is that so many men are not, in fact, rational or necessarily have that same ability to be refined, even elite men. And so so that's one thing, but the other thing is women also have the ability to be rational and thinking. And so what does that actually mean? These are questions that sort of question the patriarchal notions that are put forward in these texts.
All right. Thanks. We have one more question. It's probably the last question we can take due to time constraint.
Mm.
And this is a question that I think a lot of us who are in academia will struggle with. How can a philosophical turn trickle down into society? This philosophical turn that you're advocating, how could it trickle down into society?
I would hope that with shared vocabulary, it goes a long way. So in academia, so much of our terms are mysterious to the lay population, right? So even my book, right? It's, I felt the need to break down definitions and put them on my website because I felt like it otherwise would be inaccessible. The book would be inaccessible to people, and that's the nature of academia. In order to get raises and promotions, you have to, in a way, engage only with other academics, and at least until you reach a certain status, and then you can potentially become a public intellectual. And I think one of the ways in which we can potentially alleviate some of that divide is to sort of think through shared vocabularies, right? So, I talk a lot about the need for intersectionality and intersectional thinking in accommodating people of multiple races and classes and multiple abilities and sexualities and so on within moving forward philosophical ideas about widening the access to the good life and widening the definition of humanity, and so intersectionality happens to be a term that is fairly common feminist term that lots of people are sort of grappling with and dealing with. It did come from academia, but it's not limited to it. I think a lot of terms are like that. I think also academics adopting terms that lay people use is really important as well. So shared vocabulary, I think, is an important first step for sure.
Well, thank you. We have a few more comments. Nicole Carreri said, "Salam, Nicole. You're speaking in a great model for me." We have somebody watching from Malaysia, another person from Atlanta Metro, that's Atlanta, Georgia. And then somebody watching from Finland, University of Helsinki. So we have truly a global audience. And interestingly, a lot of them are along the edges. So it fits well within our Islam on the Edges framework. We have a comment from Catherine, or a question saying, does and can that actually work? I'm not quite sure. Is this referring maybe to your last answer? Can that work? I don't know if you maybe wanted to comment on that before we move into our last question that I have for you and kind of try to close this discussion.
Sure. Can it work? Particularly referring to shared vocabularies and so on. I mean, I think that it is a first step in order to be on the same page. You know, that the question that the person asked from about, you know, how am I using patriarchy is an important one, right? Because, you know, defining it is important. Being clear about what I'm talking about is important. And I think, you know, conversations like these that are truly global are really wonderful too, because it enables us to have these conversations about what are the terms that academics are using to talk about hierarchy and patriarchy and problematic sources that one engages in. And I think the philosophical turn is an important one, particularly because so much of the conversation is about sort of a debate back and forth between what interpretations are valid and what are not valid, and what are valid methods of interpretation of religious texts. And but thinking philosophically actually helps us to ask the bigger questions about access and exclusion, and tackling some of the larger issues about our understanding of the human condition and multiplicity of human experiences, in ways that the back and forth between and, you know, interpretive traditions or interpretive frameworks sometimes misses. So so hopefully it does work, to answer the question, I guess. Yeah.
All right, thanks. We have a comment from Turkey. Somebody is saying, congratulations, your book is a great work. So you have members all around the world.
Thank you.
My final question to you would be, so you do not in your book only engage these works and dissect them and highlight their contents and then critique them, but you also at the end of the book provide what you see as a sort of a groundwork for a new type of conversation that Muslims could be having. People in general who are interested in these type of discussions, and you call it prolegomenon to feminist philosophy of Islam. Can you tell us a little bit what is that project about, whether it's assumptions or goals and objectives? And then once you do that, maybe as a final thought, what do you think should be the main takeaways from the book for people who are reading it?
Yeah, maybe I'll go the other way. I'll do the second one first. So yeah, so the main takeaways I would say would be problematizing rationality as the least common denominator for humanity, right? So because who determines who's rational, and defining the human being insan as being the rational thinking animal, it leaves out so many people, because it leaves out disability studies has taught us that leaves out so many people, right? I mean, is somebody who doesn't have the same cognitive functions, is that person not an insan, right? Not a human being? It is just a sort of a drastic example, but it's or a more pronounced example rather. But even for, you know, thinking about difference in women, I mean, women are told not to be, that they're less rational for a long time, and so really the problematizing using rationality, right? The use of rationality as the as our definition of human, really widening that. That requires, and then as well as widening khilafa, widening without the patriarchal overtones of khilafa. I didn't get a chance to really talk about the historicity of historics of that, but certainly widening khilafa to sort of decouple it from the patriarchal stewardship and the patriarchal types of who knows better for whom, and being cognizant of differences, right? So among human beings, about and being cognizant of differences of human experience based on race and class, gender, sexuality. Those are, I would say, the important takeaways of this book. And to get at your first question, I mean, the tech, these all require deep philosophical thinking, and that's what I mean by when I say, we need to do a feminist philosophy of Islam, is, how I think of this book as a prolegomena to feminist philosophy of Islam, is I think that it opens up these questions that people should grapple with deeply philosophically.
Sure. We do have a question that I think is a very good one. Actually, it was on my mind as we were discussing, so I would also ask it. Catherine is asking, and she's watching from Indonesia, as far as I understand, how in a day-to-day practice we can still use those texts. Can we just use what is meant for men, for us as women?
It's a great question, and there's no doubt that people do, right? So the texts are really, really compelling, and this is why I had to write this book, is that people love them, and that they are really appealing. They, some circles like to call akhlaq Islamic psychology, because so much of the texts are really sort of getting at sort of deeper ideas about how people behave, and so on. And I feel like the compelling nature of these texts really prompts people to ask questions like these, of, can't we just think that it applies to women too and move on? And so sure you can, but the longer answer, I think the more nuanced answer would be to say that the only problem with doing that is that so much of the text necessitate and require subordination of others, right? That the entire akhlaq edifice, in a way, requires utilization of others, instrumentalization of others. So for example, the texts, they talk about how to find a good wife. They're not talking about how to find a good spouse. They're talking about what constitutes a good wife, right? And the things that constitute a good wife happen to be the things that put men in a superordinate and women in a subordinate position, right? And the ethicists talk about, well, and when at the moment at which a woman is calling the shots in the home, that is grounds for divorce, and that you should go ahead and divorce, men should go ahead and divorce. And so when that is the framework, when the framework of how one orients oneself towards others is based on exclusion and utilization, then the entire, in a way, the entire akhlaq edifice is not necessarily, I wouldn't say tainted, I would say it's built upon the utilization of others, right? So, or even in discussions about how one should comport oneself with men in the text, right? That those are all very much still talking about, in a way, an exploitative kind of relationship. And that's not to say that, we should get rid of all hierarchy and everybody will always be equal, because that's idealistic, but rather, but it's to say that to give people access and chance, right, is really the philosophical goal of the day that these texts are missing the mark on, right? They in a way are contradictory in and of themselves, right? So the goal is to become a khalifa, the goal is to become refined, ethically refined, and access the good life. But then if one does that while not allowing those around him, and usually it's a man, right, to have that same kind of access, then what is the meaning of good life, right? And so yeah, so sure, you know, a woman can potentially read some of the nuggets of truth, and there are lots of wonderful, I mean, nuggets of wisdom, rather. There are wonderful nuggets of wisdom within these texts, but again, so much of them requires and relies on this edifice of utilization of others and women and non-elite and so on and so forth, and assumes that they know less, that it really requires us to sort of engage with them philosophically and deeply grapple with them.
Right, thank you. So as a final sort of comment or remark or question is there anything that you would like to add to our discussion? Maybe something that you really feel you would want to share with us, but nobody had really asked about or we haven't touched upon?
I would hope that being cognizant of differences among human experience. I mean, it's not something that no one has asked about or that I haven't mentioned before, but I think that that's really an important takeaway from all of this, is to sort of be able to realize that one's own experience of life is shaped by so many factors, and other people's experiences may not be the same as yours. I mean, these are very sort of basic kinds of things, but you know, to say that one's race and class and sexuality and gender and so on, they all are shaped by certain factors, and the way that one performs these things, and are shaped by societal factors, or socialized, and that you know, being cognizant of differences in human experience actually, as I said, it's a very basic thing, but it enables us to think more deeply philosophically about how one can accommodate these differences in notions of shared humanity, in notions of what our definition of humanity is, what our shared and individual purposes would be, and if there is anything you know, shared necessarily. But yeah, these are the things that I would like us to think about.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. Thank you to our audience for watching. We hope that there'll be many more that will watch once this is uploaded on YouTube, and we'll share the link. It's actually the same link, so it can be viewed at a later date as well. Dr. Ayubi, thank you so much for your time. This was a wonderful discussion, and wish you all the best in your scholarship.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me, and thanks to this global audience from the periphery. Appreciate it.
Of course. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.